In the unforgiving heart of the Arizona Territory, where the sun bleaches bone and the wind whispers forgotten names, a story was etched into the sand, not with ink, but with blood thread and a thirst for justice that could not be quenched. This isn't a tall tale told around a campfire. This is the chronicle of Josephine Bellwether, a woman whose voice was stolen, her world burned to ash, and her body left for the buzzards. It's the story of a dying cowboy's final act of mercy, and how a simple blade in the hands of a good man didn't just cut stitches. It carved a path for one of the West's most harrowing tales of survival and retribution. The year was 1888. The Sonoran Desert was a furnace, a sprawling anvil upon which the sun hammered down with relentless fury. Under the oppressive white dome of the sky, Benedetto Benny Lowe knew he was dying. The gut shot he'd taken 2 days prior, a parting gift from a card sharp in a dusty cantina south of Tucson, had turned his insides to full and rot. He'd managed to get away, but his horse was spent, and his own strength was a flickering candle flame in a gale. He wasn't a hero. He'd been a ranch hand, a prospector, a Pinkerton, for a short, regrettable spell, and more often than not, a man who found trouble as easily as a diviner finds water. Now at 57, his life was leaking out of him into the thirsty sand. He slumped against a saguaro, its spiny arms reaching to the heavens like a silent prayer. This was it, the end of the trail. Buzzards circled high above, patient as priests. It was then he saw it. Not a mirage, his mind was surprisingly clear for a dying man. About 100 yards away, propped against a cluster of sun-scorched rocks, was a figure, a person. Still. Too still. Curiosity, the last active instinct he possessed, prodded him. With a groan that was half pain and half sheer grit, Benny pushed himself up and staggered towards the shape. As he drew closer, the horror of the scene began to resolve itself. It was a woman. She was alive, her chest rising and falling in shallow, desperate breaths. Her dress, once a respectable calico, was torn and stained with dirt and dried blood. Her face was a mask of suffering, her skin cracked and blistered by the sun. But that wasn't the worst of it. Her mouth was sewn shut. Benny stopped, his own agony momentarily forgotten, replaced by a cold rising dread. He had seen the depths of human cruelty in his life, hangings, brandings, scalpings, but this was a different kind of vile. It was intimate, meticulous. A thick black thread, possibly waxed linen used for leatherwork, was stitched crudely through her upper and lower lips, sealing them tight. The skin around the stitches was swollen red and infected. A thin, dark line of dried blood and fluid traced from the corners of her sealed mouth down her chin. She was dying of thirst, unable to even cry out for help, unable to drink if water miraculously appeared. It was a sentence of slow, silent agony. A grave made of one's own body. Her eyes fluttered open as his shadow fell over her. They were wide, with a terror so profound it transcended panic, a terror that had settled deep into her soul. She flinched, trying to scramble backward, but she was too weak. Benny held up his hands, palms open. They were trembling not just from the wound, but from the sight of her. "Easy now, miss," he rasped, his voice a dry crackle. I ain't gonna hurt ya." He knelt the effort, sending a fresh wave of fire through his abdomen. He uncorked his canteen. only a few precious mouthfuls left. He knew he needed it more than anything, but looking at her, at the silent, sealed plea in her eyes, he knew it wasn't his. It was hers, but she couldn't drink. "Hold still," he said, his voice softer now. He pulled out his skinning knife. It was a well-used thing. The blade sharpened so many times it was thinner than its original design, but it was honed to a razor's edge. The woman's eyes widened further, tracking the steel. A low, guttural moan escaped her, trapped behind the threads, the sound of a terrified animal. "No, no," Benny soothed, trying to channel a gentleness he rarely used. "I'm gonna help. This is gonna hurt like all hell. But it's the only way. You understand?" She stared at him, a flicker of comprehension, warring with the instinct to flee. He saw a tear trace a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "All right then," he breathed, steeling himself. He knew he only had one shot at this before his strength gave out entirely. He shuffled closer, his left hand coming up to gently cup the side of her face. His thumb was calloused and rough, but his touch was surprisingly steady. "Close your eyes." She did. He brought the tip of the blade to the first stitch at the corner of her lips. He had to be careful not to slice her lip open any further. He slid the point under the tight thread, and with a quick, decisive flick of his wrist, cut it. A choked gasp, a shudder that racked her entire body. He moved to the next one. Snip, and the next. Snip. Each cut was answered by a pained whimper, a fresh bead of blood. The smell of infection and misery filled the small space between them. He worked methodically, his focus absolute, the world narrowing to the black thread, the ravaged skin, and the sharp point of his knife. The sun beat down. The buzzards circled lower. His own vision began to swim. Finally, he cut the last thread in the center. The tension was gone. Her lips, swollen and bleeding, parted slightly. He pulled back the knife, falling from his numb fingers. There he wheezed, leaning back on his heels. "It's done." He fumbled for his canteen and brought it to her mouth. "Just a little," he whispered. "Easy does it." He tilted it, and a trickle of lukewarm water flowed over her ruined lips and into her mouth. She coughed the first real sound she'd made, a raw, painful bark that tore at her throat. But then she began to drink small, desperate swallows. She drank until the canteen was empty, her eyes never leaving his. When the last drop was gone, she tried to speak. Only a faint, airy hiss came out. The agony of moving her lips, of using atrophied muscles, was excruciating. Don't try to talk," Benny said, slumping back against the rock. The finality of his act had spent the last of his reserves. The world was going grey at the edges. "My horse, Diablo. He's over yonder. Good horse. Knows the way to water." He unbuckled his gun belt, the weight of the Schofield revolver, and the cartridges suddenly unbearable. He pushed it towards her. "You take this. There's bad folk out here." Her eyes filled with a question she couldn't ask. Why are you doing this?" Benny gave a weak, bloody smile. "I've done a lot of wrong, miss. Reckon I ought to do one right thing before I cash in my chips." He coughed a wet, rattling sound. "Get going. North. Follow the mountains. You'll find a town. Redemption Bluff. Tell 'em Benny Lowe sent ya." He laid his head back against the saguaro, his eyes closing. His breathing grew shallow. The woman whose name was Josephine Bellwether, though she could not speak, it watched the man who had saved her die. She felt a profound, aching grief for this stranger, the first person to show her kindness after an eternity of cruelty. With strength she didn't know she possessed, she crawled to her feet. She looked down at the gun belt, then at the dying man, and then to the north. She took the gun belt. She took the knife, and with one last look at her savior, she turned and stumbled towards his horse, every step a universe of pain, a new life beginning with the death of a cowboy in the desert. The journey to Redemption Bluff was a fever dream, painted in shades of ochre and crimson. Diablo, true to Benny's word, was a smart and steady beast, and for much of the 2-day trek, Josephine simply clung to the saddle horn, drifting in and out of consciousness. The pain in her mouth was a constant throbbing beast, a reminder of the threads that had bound her. But a new pain was blooming, the pain of memory. With every jolting step of the horse, fragments of her past broke through the fog of trauma. Flashes of green, the lush, impossible green of her family's ranch, Viridian Springs, an oasis fed by a deep, cool aquifer that made their land the envy of the county. The smell of her mother's baking of her father's pipe tobacco. The sound of her younger brother Thomas laughing as they raced horses across the pastures. The Bellwether name had meant something. It meant water life and prosperity in a land defined by its scarcity. And then the other memories came dark and sharp as obsidian shards. A man's face, handsome at first glance, eyes the color of a pale winter sky, a charismatic smile that didn't reach them. His name was Corcoran Kane. He'd come to them with an offer a handsome sum for Viridian Springs. He spoke of progress of a syndicate he represented, of bringing a new era of prosperity to the territory. His words were smooth as polished river stones. Her father, William Bellwether, a man as sturdy and unyielding as the oaks on his land, had refused. "This land is not for sale, Mr. Kane," he'd said, his voice calm but absolute. "It is my family's legacy and its future." Kane's smile had faltered for just a second, a flicker of something cold and predatory in his gaze. He'd tried again, his offers growing more generous, his tone shifting from persuasion to pressure. The refusals remained firm. The visits stopped, and then the trouble started. Fences cut, cattle poisoned, a barn burned in the dead of night. They knew it was Kane, but the local law sheriff Brody in the nearby town of Silver Creek was a man whose pockets were known to jingle with coins that weren't his own. He found no culprits. The last day replayed in her mind in a brutal, unending loop. Kane hadn't come with offers this time. He'd come with a dozen armed riders, their faces hard and merciless. They'd dragged her father and Thomas from the house. She remembered her mother's screams, then the chilling silence that followed the gunshots. They had saved her for last. Kane had stood before her, the smoke from his pistol still curling in the air, that same cold smile on his face. "You have a fire in you, Josephine," he'd said, his voice a low purr. And a voice. "People listen to a pretty girl with a claim to the richest water in this territory. We can't have that. I'm not going to kill you. I'm going to erase you. When they find you, you'll be nothing. A nameless, voiceless ghost in the desert." She'd fought, kicking and spitting, screaming his name, calling him a devil. That was when he'd produced the needle and the black waxed thread. He held her down himself, his winter sky eyes boring into hers as his men pinned her limbs. The first pierce of the needle was a white-hot agony that eclipsed everything else. He was methodical, unhurried, turning her screams into muffled, tortured grunts. The last thing she remembered before the darkness claimed her was his whisper in her ear. "Now let's see you stake your claim." Diablo's sudden stop jolted her back to the present. Before her, nestled in a dip between two mesas, were the scattered, dusty buildings of a town. A faded sign read, "Redemption Bluff. Poppy, 142. She slid from the saddle, her legs buckling. A man in a smithing apron looked up from his forge, his eyes widening at the sight of her. People stopped in the street. They saw a woman who looked like she'd wrestled with death and barely won, her face swollen and bruised, her lips a mess of cuts and puncture marks, her dress in tatters, a man's gun belt strapped awkwardly around her waist. She tried to speak, to say the name Benny Lowe had given her, but all that came out was a dry, rasping croak. She pointed a trembling finger at the building with a swinging sign that depicted a mortar and pestle. The doctor. She collapsed before she reached the door. She awoke on a narrow cot in a clean, sparse room that smelled of carbolic acid and lavender. A woman was dabbing her forehead with a cool, damp cloth. She was in her late 40s, with intelligent, discerning eyes and hair pinned up in a severe but practical bun. "Easy now. You're safe," the woman said, her voice calm and professional. "I'm Dr. Eleanor Gable. You've got a severe case of dehydration and sunstroke. And your mouth. My God! Whoever did that to you, I hope they rot." Josephine's own eyes welled with tears, a mix of relief and overwhelming pain. Dr. Gable continued, her tone gentle but firm. "I've cleaned the wounds as best I can. It's badly infected. You'll have scars. I need you to sip this broth I've made. You need sustenance. Don't try to talk yet. Just rest." For the next week, Josephine lived in that small room behind Dr. Gable's surgery. Eleanor was a woman of few well-chosen words. She'd come out west from Philadelphia after her husband died, seeking a place where a woman doctor would be judged on her skill rather than her gender. She was respected in Redemption Bluff, if not entirely embraced. She saw in Josephine not a victim to be pitied, but a puzzle to be solved and a patient to be healed. Slowly, with Eleanor's patient care, Josephine began to recover. The swelling on her face subsided, leaving behind a latticework of thin, pale scars around her lips. Eating was an ordeal, but she forced herself. Her voice returned day by day, starting as a whisper, then graduating to a hoarse, scratchy rasp that was painful to produce and to hear. One evening, as Eleanor was changing the dressing on her lips, Josephine finally spoke a full sentence. Her voice was low, and each word felt like dragging stones across sand. His name was Corcoran Kane. Eleanor stopped what she was doing and looked at her, her expression grim. "I know the name. He's been buying up land all over the territory. He has a headquarters near Silver Creek. Rumor is he's as ruthless as they come." "He killed them," Josephine rasped the words, tearing at her. "My family, for our land, Viridian Springs." Eleanor's face softened with a deep, sorrowful empathy. "I am so sorry. Truly." She finished her work in silence, her movements precise and thoughtful. "What he did to you," she said finally, "was meant to break you, to silence you forever. The question you have to ask yourself now, Josephine, is, are you going to let him succeed?" That night, Josephine didn't sleep. She lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling, Dr. Gable's question echoing in her mind. She thought of her family lying in unmarked graves on the land they loved. She thought of Corcoran Kane living and thriving his empire, built on her family's blood. and she thought of Benedetto Lowe, a dying stranger who had shown her more humanity in his last 10 minutes than Kane possessed in his entire being. She touched the faint puckered scars on her lips. They weren't just a mark of her torment. They were a reminder. Kane hadn't wanted to kill her. He'd wanted to erase her. He had sewn her mouth shut, to steal her voice, her story, her claim. A cold, hard resolve began to form in the pit of her stomach, displacing the fear and grief. He had failed. He had left her in the desert to be silenced by the sun and sand. But the desert had given her a savior. It had given her a second chance. He had wanted to take her voice, but in doing so he had given her something far more powerful, a reason to scream. She got up and walked to the small table where her few possessions lay. She picked up Benny Lowe's Schofield revolver. It felt heavy, cold, and purposeful in her hand. Her reflection in the small, cracked mirror was a stranger's. A gaunt, haunted-looking woman with scars on her mouth and a fire in her eyes. The old Josephine Bellwether was gone, buried with her family at Viridian Springs. This new person, this survivor, had a different name. It was Vengeance, and she was just learning how to speak. The woman who was once Josephine Bellwether spent the next 3 months in the crucible of redemption bluff, forging herself into a weapon. Her days fell into a harsh, disciplined rhythm fueled by Dunkel, nourishing broths, and her own burning purpose. Her first task was to reclaim her voice, not just the physical ability to speak, but its strength and clarity. Every morning she would walk to the edge of town, where the desert winds swept across the plains, and she would read aloud from one of Eleanor's medical texts. At first, her voice was a fragile, scraping thing. The scars on her lips pulled and burned, and her throat felt raw. But she pushed through the pain, her voice growing stronger, steadier, losing its rasp and taking on a new timbre, lower than before and laced with a gravelly resolve. Her second task was to master the tool Benny Lowe had bequeathed her. Behind the doctor's office was a small, secluded arroyo. There she practiced with the Schofield revolver. The first time she fired it, the recoil bruised her wrist, and the noise made her flinch. She was clumsy, inaccurate, wasting precious ammunition. Eleanor helped her procure from the general store. An old prospector named Peterson, a man with a wild grey beard and eyes that had seen too much sun, often watched her from a distance while he panned for flecks of gold in a nearby stream. One afternoon, he ambled over, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "You're holding it like it's gonna bite you, girl." He grunted, his voice like rocks grinding together. "You gotta make it a part of your arm. Don't fight the kick roll with it. Squeeze the trigger, don't jerk it. And for God's sake, breathe out when you fire." He wasn't a kind teacher, but he was a practical one. He showed her how to stand, how to aim with both eyes open, how to reload quickly, ejecting all 6 spent cartridges with a single break action motion. He taught her the rhythm of the gun. Slowly, her shots grew more accurate. The tin cans she set up on a fence post began to dance and fly. She learned to clean the weapon until it shone, to understand its mechanisms intimately. The Schofield No. 3 became as familiar to her as her own hands. While her body and voice healed, her mind was a whirlwind of strategy. She knew she couldn't simply ride into Silver Creek and call out Corcoran Kane. He was a king in his own domain, surrounded by hired guns and protected by a bought and paid-for sheriff. A direct assault would be suicide. Kane had tried to erase her to make her a ghost, so a ghost she would become. a phantom that would haunt the edges of his empire and dismantle it piece by piece. She needed information. Doc saw Gable using her trips to larger towns for medical supplies, began to subtly ask questions. She learned the names of Kane's key lieutenants, a brutish foreman named Hank Grissom, and a younger, more cunning deputy, a man named Fletcher, who was always at Kane's side. She learned the routes his cattle drives took, the locations of his line camps, and the source of his political power, a group of East Coast investors who knew him only as a successful land developer, not a murderer. Josephine's greatest ally, however, was the desert itself. It was the weapon Kane had chosen for her execution, and she would turn it against him. She learned its secrets from Peterson the prospector. He taught her how to read the land, to find water where none seemed to exist, to move silently through the scrub and rock. He taught her which plants were edible, which were poison, and which could be used to create potent powders that could spook cattle or incapacitate a man. One evening, as she sat with Eleanor, she laid out her plan. It was audacious, dangerous, and bordered on madness. "I'm not going after Kane," she said, her new voice steady and low. "I'm going after his water." Eleanor looked at her, understanding dawning in her eyes. In the territory, water was more valuable than gold. It was life. It was power. His biggest ranch, the Bar K, relies on a series of wells and cisterns fed by the San Pedro River. Josephine explained, tracing a map she'd drawn in the dirt floor. His cattle drives have to pass through specific canyons to reach the railhead at Benson. If you control the water, you control the movement. You create chaos. "This is incredibly dangerous," Josephine Eleanor warned, though there was no judgment in her voice, only concern. "Being left to die in the desert with my mouth sewn shut was dangerous." Josephine counted, her hand instinctively touching the scars. "This is necessary. I need supplies. Non-perishables, and more ammunition and a good horse to spare. I have the money from my family's emergency stash that I buried." Eleanor looked at the transformed woman before her. The frightened, broken creature who had collapsed on her doorstep was gone. In her place stood someone forged in fire, her eyes holding the cold, hard light of the desert stars. "All right," Eleanor said with a sigh. "I'll help you get the supplies, but you must be careful. Kane has eyes everywhere." A week later, Josephine was ready. She now had 2 horses. Benny's sturdy Diablo and a swift mare she named Whisper. Her saddlebags were packed with dried beef hardtack ammunition and Peterson's herbal concoctions. She wore practical men's trousers and a durable shirt, her hair tied back tightly. The Schofield was holstered on her hip, and a Winchester rifle was sheathed on her saddle. She looked less like a rancher's daughter, and more like a wraith of the Badlands. She rode out from Redemption Bluff under the cover of a moonless night, leaving a note for Eleanor. "Thank you. I will not fail." Her first target was an isolated line camp at the northern edge of Kane's vast rangeland. She watched it for a day, from a high ridge, studying the movements of the 3 cowboys stationed there. They were lazy and complacent, secure in the belief that no one would dare challenge Corcoran Kane. That night, she crept down to their camp. She didn't want to kill them. They were just pawns. She used her knife, Benny Lowe's knife, to slit their water skins, letting the precious liquid drain into the sand. She contaminated their water barrel with a foul-tasting but harmless powder Peterson had given her. Then she opened the gate to their small horse corral, slapping the animals on their rumps and sending them scattering into the night. The next morning, the cowboys awoke to find themselves without water and without mounts, stranded 30 miles from the main ranch. Their immediate trouble was survival, not guarding Kane's territory. News of the incident traveled slowly, dismissed as an accident or the work of vagrants. But then it happened again. A different camp, this time further south. Then a critical cistern was drained, forcing a crew to abandon their position. Whispers started to spread among Kane's men. It was odd, unnerving. There were never any tracks, no witnesses. Just the quiet, crippling sabotage. They started calling it the Dust Devil, a phantom that struck and vanished. Corcoran Kane, sitting in his plush office in Silver Creek, was growing irritated. These were minor annoyances, but they were disrupting his operations, costing him time and money. His foreman, the hulking Hank Grissom, was furious. "It's gotta be a rival outfit." "Boss," Grissom growled, his fists clenched. "Nobody else has the sand." Kane leaned back in his leather chair, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on his desk. His pale eyes were narrowed in thought. "No," he said softly. "A rival would be louder. They'd want to make a statement, try to rustle our prize stock. This is different. This is personal. It's quiet, precise. Someone is trying to bleed us, not break us." He looked at his young deputy Fletcher. "Fletcher, I want you to double the patrols. I want riders checking every well, every cistern twice a day. Find who is doing this. I don't care how you do it. I want a name." Fletcher nodded, his face impassive. "Yes, sir." But as he turned to leave, his eyes held a flicker of something Kane couldn't read, a deep, unsettling disquiet. Josephine, meanwhile, was growing bolder. Her next target was Kane's primary source of income, a massive cattle drive of 2,000 head destined for the rail yards. She knew she couldn't stop it, but she could cripple it. She found the place she was looking for, a narrow pass known as Diablo's Throat, the only viable route through a stretch of badlands. For 2 days, she worked setting up her trap. She planted bundles of dry brush and tumbleweeds, soaked in oil, at the mouth of the canyon. As the massive herd approached, the air thick with dust and the lowing of cattle, she waited hidden in the rocks high above. Grissom himself was leading the drive, shouting orders, his face a mask of sweaty determination. When the lead steers entered the canyon, Josephine struck a match. She lit a fuse that snaked down to her preparations. With a whoosh, a wall of fire and thick black smoke erupted across the canyon mouth. The cattle panicked. The herd, a living river of beef and horn, turned on itself in terror. The cowboys were powerless, their shouts lost in the bellows of thousands of frightened animals. The stampede was immediate and catastrophic. The herd scattered in a dozen directions, charging blindly into the rock-strewn badlands. It would take weeks to round up even half of them, and many would be lost for good. From her perch, Josephine watched the chaos she had unleashed. She saw Grissom, his face black with soot and rage, screaming curses into the sky. She felt no joy, only a yield grim satisfaction. This was the language Kane understood, the language of loss of power, slipping through his fingers. She slipped away before the first riders could even think to look up. The ghost of the desert had struck again, and this time the whispers would turn into roar. In Silver Creek, Corcoran Kane would soon learn that the woman he had tried to bury in silence was now the name everyone on his payroll was beginning to fear. The disastrous stampede at Diablo's Throat sent shockwaves through Corcoran Kane's organization. It wasn't just the financial loss which was substantial. It was the psychological blow. An invisible, untouchable force was dismantling his empire. Fear like a cancer began to eat at the loyalty of his hired guns. Men started quitting, spooked by the idea of a phantom that could command fire and scatter herds. In his opulent office, Kane was a study in controlled fury. The charming facade had vanished, replaced by the raw predator beneath. He had smashed a decanter of expensive whiskey against the wall, its amber contents staining the fine wallpaper like old blood. "Find me this ghost!" he roared at Grissom and Fletcher. "I don't care if you have to burn down every homestead from here to the Mexican border. Find them." Grissom. His pride wounded, was eager for blood. "We'll get him, boss. Don't you worry." But Fletcher remained silent, his gaze distant. He had been at Diablo's throat. He'd seen the precision of the trap. It wasn't the work of a common raider. It was intelligent, vengeful. The name Bellwether had been nagging at the back of his mind for months, a ghost of a different sort. He had been there that day, at Viridian Springs. He was a young, ambitious deputy, then eager to prove his worth to Kane. He hadn't pulled a trigger, but he had held Josephine's mother down. The memory was a sickness in his gut he couldn't shake. He'd told himself the girl was dead, a convenient lie to soothe a guilty conscience. But now he wasn't so sure. Josephine knew Kane's fury would make him reckless. She also knew her time as a ghost was limited. She needed to escalate her plan to move from attacking his assets to attacking his authority. She needed to bring the fight from the desolate wilderness into the heart of his power, the town of Silver Creek. Her plan was a dangerous gamble, one that required her to do the one thing she had sworn she might never do again: willingly walk into a room full of her enemies. She returned to Redemption Bluff, seeking out Dr. Gable. "I need a disguise," Josephine said, her voice devoid of hesitation. "Something that will let me walk into the Silver Creek saloon unnoticed." Eleanor looked her over. "That's not easy. Your face, the scars are distinctive." "Then we hide them," Josephine replied. For the next few days, the two women worked. Eleanor, with her knowledge of anatomy and aesthetics, was surprisingly adept. They used powders and salves to darken Josephine's skin, giving her the weathered look of a traveler who'd spent too long on the trail. A low-brimmed hat would shadow the upper half of her face. The real challenge was her mouth. They found a solution in a painted silk veil, the kind some high society women wore to protect their complexions from the dust. It was unusual, but not unheard of. It would obscure her scars while adding an air of mystery. Dressed in a modest but well-made riding dress, she looked like a woman of some means, perhaps a land buyer or the wife of an investor. Her objective was the Grand Excelsior Saloon in Silver Creek on a Saturday night. It was Kane's unofficial court, the place where he held sway, where his men drank, and where business was done. When she rode into Silver Creek, her heart hammered against her ribs. This was the town where her family's murder had been sanctioned, where Sheriff Brody polished his badge with Kane's money. The Grand Excelsior was even more garish than she'd imagined, all polished wood brass fixtures and loud piano music spilling out into the street. Taking a deep breath, she tethered Whisper in a dark alleyway and walked to the entrance. The batwing doors swung open, and a wave of noise smoke and the smell of stale beer washed over her. She pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The saloon fell silent for a beat. All eyes turned to the veiled woman who had just entered. Then, dismissing her as an oddity, the noise swelled again. She moved to a small, shadowed table in the corner, her eyes scanning the room from behind the silk. There he was, Corcoran Kane, holding court at a large round table flanked by Grissom and a nervous-looking Sheriff Brody. Fletcher stood behind him. His arms crossed his face, a stone mask. Kane was laughing a broad, theatrical laugh, projecting an aura of unshakable confidence for his men. Josephine ordered a sarsaparilla from a passing waitress and waited, her hand resting on her lap, inches from the small, concealed derringer Eleanor had insisted she take. The showfield was too conspicuous. She didn't have to wait long. Kane's investors, the reason for his performance, were at a nearby table. One of them, a portly man from Boston, named Mr. Abernathy, called over. "Mr. Kane, we're hearing troubling rumors about a stampede, significant losses." Kane's smile didn't falter. He waved a dismissive hand. "A spot of bad luck, gentlemen. A lightning strike spooked the herd. The desert is a harsh mistress, as they say. Nothing my men can't handle. My operations are as secure as Fort Knox." This was her moment. From her corner table, Josephine spoke. Her voice, amplified by the saloon's acoustics, cut through the din. It was not loud, but it was clear, cold, and carried an authority that commanded attention. "That's a lie." The saloon went dead quiet. Every head turned towards the veiled woman. Kane's smile vanished, his pale eyes narrowing as he tried to place her. "I beg your pardon, madam," he said, his tone dripping with menace. Josephine stood up slowly. Her veiled face turned directly towards him. "It wasn't lightning, Mr. Kane. It was fire. A fourbourg set deliberately in Diablo's throat. Just as the fires that burned out your line camps weren't accidents. Just as the poison in your wells wasn't bad water." A murmur went through the room. Kane's men shifted their hands, moving towards their guns. Grissom started to rise, a snarl on his face. "Who the hell are you?" Grissom bellowed. Josephine ignored him, her entire focus on Kane. "You call it bad luck, but you know what it is. It's a reckoning. You built an empire on stolen land and spilled blood, and now the ghosts of your victims have come to collect." Kane's face was white with rage. The veil was preventing him from seeing her clearly, but something in her voice, a faint, familiar cadence beneath the hardened tone, was unsettling him. "Sheriff, arrest this woman for public slander." Sheriff Brody, sweating profusely, started to get up, but he hesitated. The woman's confidence was unnerving. "Ask him about Viridian Springs." "Sheriff," Josephine's voice rang out. "Ask him about the Bellwether family. Ask him what happened to William and Thomas Bellwether. Ask him what he did to the daughter, Josephine." At the mention of her name, Fletcher's impassive facade finally cracked. His eyes widened in horrified recognition. He looked from the veiled woman to Kane, the truth crashing down on him. Kane shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly. "Enough, I will not be harassed by some hysterical veiled whore." He started towards her, his intentions clear. But Fletcher moved faster. In a swift, shocking motion, he stepped in front of Kane, blocking his path. "Boss, no," Fletcher said, his voice low and strained. "Fletcher, get out of my way, or so help me. God, It's her," Fletcher whispered, his horrified gaze locked on Josephine. "My God, it's her." The admission hung in the air, a confession that condemned them both. The investors stared, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. Kane's men looked from Fletcher to their boss, their certainty wavering. The spell was broken. Kane understood. This wasn't just a ghost. This was his ghost. "You," he breathed, all pretense of control gone, his face contorting into a mask of pure hatred. In that moment of chaos, Josephine knew it was time to leave. She hadn't come for a gunfight. She had come to plant a seed of doubt, to strip away Cain's authority with the truth. She had used her voice, the very thing he'd tried to destroy, as her weapon. She backed away towards the batwing doors. "It's not over, Cain," she called out, her voice a final, chilling promise. "I'm not a ghost. I'm the woman you left in the desert, and I am your end." She slipped out into the night, leaving behind a saloon in turmoil. She had turned Cain's fortress into a viper's nest of suspicion. She had revealed his deputy as a man with a guilty conscience, and Cain himself as a liar. Fletcher's moment of defiance was a crack in the foundation of Cain's power, and Josephine knew that soon the whole rotten structure would come crashing down. As she rode away from Silver Creek, the sounds of shouting and chaos fading behind her, she felt the first stirrings of something that wasn't just vengeance. It was justice. The confrontation in the saloon shattered Corcoran Cain's world. The public accusation, coupled with Fletcher's damning reaction, sent his investors scrambling. They wanted answers, not evasions. His authority, once absolute, now rested on a knife's edge. He became a sword animal, paranoid and vicious, seeing betrayal in every shadow. His first act was to confront Fletcher. He cornered him in the stables behind the saloon, his pale eyes burning with a cold fire. "You knew," Cain hissed. "You knew it was her." Fletcher, no longer the impassive deputy, met his gaze. The guilt he had carried for months had finally found its voice. "I suspected. After Diablo's throat, I knew no one else could have that kind of reason. We were wrong, Cain. What we did at that ranch was an abomination." For his defiance, Cain beat him senseless, leaving him bleeding in the straw. But the damage was done. Fletcher, broken, but now free of Cain's influence, deserted that night, taking with him the truth of what happened at Viridian Springs. Josephine knew the final confrontation was at hand. Cain was wounded, his power base crumbling. He would be desperate, and a desperate Cain would be drawn back to the source of his original sin. She sent a message via a trusted freight driver to Dr. Gable Tell Fletcher to meet me at the old Bellwether Ranch. It's time to end this. She rode to Viridian Springs. It was a place of ghosts. The main house was a blackened shell, a monument to her loss. The once lush pastures were overgrown with weeds. But the spring itself, the heart of the land, still flowed clear and pure. It was here she would make her stand. She didn't have to wait long. Fletcher arrived first, his face bruised and swollen, but his eyes clear. "He's coming," Fletcher said. "He's gathered the last of his loyal men, maybe a half-dozen, including Grissom. He's telling them we're going to ambush the ghost. But I think he's coming to finish the job he started." "He won't find a ghost," Josephine said, checking the action on her Winchester. "He'll find me." They didn't fortify the burned-out house. That was a death trap. Instead, they used the land itself. They took up positions in the cluster of old oaks on a rise overlooking the spring, the very place she and her brother Thomas used to play. It offered a clear view of the approach to the house and the water source. Cain and his men rode in at dusk, the setting sun, casting long, distorted shadows. They approached cautiously, spreading out guns drawn. Cain at the center scanned the ruins, his face a grim caricature of his former confidence. "Show yourself." Cain bellowed, his voice echoing in the quiet valley. "Show yourself, you witch!" From the cover of the oaks. Josephine answered, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I'm here, Cain, on the land you stole, the land that remembers you." Grissom and the others opened fire on the grove of trees' bullets, splintering bark and tearing through leaves. Josephine and Fletcher held their fire, letting the volley exhaust itself. "You should have died in the desert," Kane screamed, his composure completely gone. "You should have killed me when you had the chance," Josephine shouted back. "But you were too arrogant. You wanted to make a statement. You wanted to silence me. Do I sound silent to you, Kane?" Her words were a poison arrow finding their mark. Enraged, Kane spurred his horse forward, charging recklessly towards the spring. "Grissom with me, the rest of you flush her out." This was the moment she'd waited for. As Kane and Grissom galloped into the open ground near the water, Josephine rose from her cover. She didn't fire the Winchester. She raised Benny Lowe's Schofield. Her first shot was not aimed at Kane. It was for his horse. The animal screamed and went down, pitching Kane into the muddy bank of the spring. Her second shot was for Grissom. The big man clutched his shoulder, howling in pain, as he tumbled from his saddle. The remaining riders, seeing their leaders fall and hearing a second rifle crack from Fletcher's position, lost their nerve. They turned and fled, abandoning their boss to his fate. Kane scrambled to his feet, covered in mud, his fancy suit ruined. He had lost his rifle in the fall. He was alone, disarmed, standing in the very water he had murdered a family to possess. Josephine walked slowly out of the trees, the Schofield held steady in her hand. She stopped 20 feet from him. This wasn't about a long-distance killing. This was about a reckoning. "It's over," she said, her voice quiet but final. Kane stared at her, at the scarred mouth, at the eyes that held no fear, only judgment. He saw the spectre of his own downfall. "You," he stammered. "Who helped you? You couldn't have done this alone." "A dying cowboy gave me a knife and a second chance," she said. "A good doctor gave me a safe harbor. A guilty man." She nodded towards Fletcher, who was now approaching. "Gave me the truth. But this part is all me." He saw the resolve in her eyes and knew there was no escape. A final desperate sneer curled his lips. "You think this changes anything? They'll still call you a killer. You'll be the one who hangs. Maybe," she replied calmly. "But the story will be told. Your investors will know they backed a murderer. The law will have a witness," she gestured again to Fletcher. "And everyone in this territory will know that the bellwether claim was paid for in blood. Your name will be a curse, Corcoran. You won't be remembered as an empire builder. You'll be remembered as the man who was brought down by the woman whose mouth he sewed shut." She raised the pistol, the setting sun glinting off the barrel. His pale eyes widened in a final moment of terror. The shot echoed through the valley of Viridian Springs. It was a full stop at the end of a bloody chapter. In the aftermath, Fletcher went to the U.S. Marshals in Tucson. His testimony, combined with the collapse of Kane's syndicate, brought the whole sordid affair to light. The story of Josephine Bellwether became a legend in the territory not of a bloodthirsty killer, but of impossible survival and relentless justice. She never sought fame. She reclaimed her family's name and their land. With the help of a few loyal hands, she began the slow process of rebuilding Viridian Springs. The scars around her mouth remained a permanent reminder of the horror she had endured. But they were no longer a mark of shame. They were a testament to her strength, a symbol of a voice that refused to be silenced. She had been left in the desert to be erased, but instead she had been reborn in its fire. Her new life a gift from a dying cowboy who performed one last perfect act of kindness. The story of Josephine Bellwether is a stark reminder that the history of the American West was written not just by famous lawmen and notorious outlaws, but by ordinary people forced into extraordinary circumstances. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the incredible power of a single voice that refuses to be silenced. Josephine's scars told a story of pain, but her life became a story of purpose. She took the very tools meant for her destruction, the cruelty, the silence, the desolate wilderness, and forged them into instruments of justice. If this piece of forgotten history moved you, please help us keep these stories alive. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates a true tale of grit and survival. And be sure to subscribe to our channel for more journeys into the dusty, dramatic, and often untold chronicles of the past. Thank you for listening.